Whispers moved through the polished corridors of St. Vincent's Medical Center long before Arthur Sterling ever stepped into a room. Arthur Sterling was not merely a CEO, but a professional dismantler of careers, and the hospital staff learned to fear his presence. To understand Elena Higgins's impact, one must first understand the suffocating climate inside St. Vincent's Medical Center in downtown Chicago. Built in the late 1940s, the institution once carried a proud legacy of community care, but financial strain had begun to hollow it out. The board solution arrived in the form of Arthur Sterling, a former hedge fund manager known for ruthless corporate turnarounds. He arrived in bespoke Navy suits worth more than most residents earned in a year and viewed hospitals as failing balance sheets rather than sanctuaries. Within 3 months, his influence settled over the institution like a hard winter. He prioritized spreadsheets, margins, and projections over patient care. His first major act was the removal of Dr. William Aries, head of pediatrics, after Aries refused to limit time spent with children. When nurses petitioned for Aries's reinstatement, Sterling fired the organizers without hesitation, framing it as insubordination. Fear quickly became policy across the hospital. By the time Elena Higgins arrived in late October, the entire facility operated under silence and anxiety. Elena Higgins, a 38-year-old trauma nurse from Detroit, had worked years in overwhelmed emergency rooms before coming to Chicago. She had taken the sickle role primarily to be near her ill mother, valuing stability over ambition, quiet and precise. She carried the resilience built from years of life and death decisions. On her first day, senior nurse Sarah Jenkins pulled her aside near the station, exhausted and wary. Sarah warned her that survival here meant silence, compliance, and avoiding Sterling at all costs. Elena nodded, but immediately noticed the deteriorating systems around her. Supplies were downgraded, staff reduced, and nurses were forced into roles once handled by entire departments. 2 weeks later, a memo announced sweeping efficiency changes that double patient loads in critical care. In situ, where 1 nurse per 2 patients was already strained, the new rule demanded 1 per 4. The staff recognized instantly that the system was becoming unsafe and unstable. Rebecca, a veteran nurse, broke down in the medication room, overwhelmed by impossible assignments. She told Elena that patients were dying on paper before they even reached treatment. Elena steadied her and realized the institution had become a machine optimized for profit over life. She understood that silence would no longer protect anyone. The hospital's fear was now matched only by its inefficiency. Elena looked across the ward and saw exhaustion written into every face. Monitors beeped faster than staff could respond, and alarms were often ignored simply to survive the shift. That evening, she stayed after rounds, reviewing charts no one else had time to check. Each file told the same story of delay, shortage, and calculated risk. Elena realized that survival in this environment depended on breaking rules rather than following them. The next day, a crisis arrived that would test every protocol the hospital had abandoned. A multi-car collision brought in victims faster than beds could be cleared. Elena moved between patients with calm precision while chaos built around her. She prioritized those most likely to survive, making decisions that others hesitated to voice. Her actions drew attention from senior physicians who had begun to notice her unusual authority. Even in the chaos, she maintained strict control over her assigned patients. By the end of the shift, several lives had been stabilized because of her decisions. Rumors about the new nurse began circulating through the corridors. Some called her reckless. Others called her the only reason the unit was still functioning. Sterling remained unaware that beneath his financial restructuring, a different kind of authority was forming. Elena prepared quietly for what she knew would eventually become a confrontation with the system itself. Because in St. Vincent's, survival was no longer about medicine alone, but about resistance. In the days that followed, Elena began quietly coordinating with trusted colleagues, mapping out every shortage and every unsafe adjustment imposed by management. She documented patterns of neglect, not for immediate rebellion, but to ensure the truth could not be buried under financial reports. Even the most senior physicians, once loyal to hospital administration, began quietly acknowledging that patient safety had been compromised beyond acceptable limits. Elena knew that confrontation with Arthur Sterling was inevitable, but she also understood it would not be fought with anger alone. It would require evidence, unity, and the courage of people who had spent too long afraid of losing their livelihoods. That night, as the hospital lights dimmed and the city outside continued its indifferent rhythm, Elena stood alone in the SICU and made a decision that would define everything that came next. Weeks of pressure, fear, and silent suffering had brought her here, and she was no longer willing to let numbers outweigh lives. Resistance was about to truly begin now. In Detroit, Elena had already seen what unchecked cost-cutting could do to medicine when profit was placed above people. She still remembered the night she lost a young patient because a hospital administrator refused to approve a transfer to a specialized center just to save a few $1,000s. That moment had carved itself into her permanently. After that, she made herself a promise. She would never stay silent again, no matter the consequences. Now, standing in St. Vincent's Medical Center, she looked at the latest memo pinned to the corkboard. Arthur Sterling, with his spreadsheets and executive confidence, believed he was moving pieces on a corporate chessboard. He saw efficiency, margins, and optimization. What he didn't realize was that he had just stepped into a game with someone who understood exactly what those numbers cost in human lives. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday night in November. The SICU was already stretched beyond safe capacity. Elena was responsible for 4 critically ill patients, moving between rooms in a constant blur of alarms, medication adjustments, and charting. The unit felt fragile, like it could collapse at any moment. Every nurse on the floor was operating at their limit, their movements slowed not by exhaustion alone, but by the weight of impossible expectations. One of her patients was Henry Caldwell, a 68-year-old retired schoolteacher recovering from a complex triple bypass surgery. He was stable only in the narrowest sense of the word, dependent on a carefully calibrated 4 infusion of blood pressure medication to prevent his heart from overworking. Any interruption in that flow could send him into cardiac collapse. In Sterling's latest round of cost-cutting, St. Vincent's had replaced its premium infusion systems with a cheaper alternative, Apex Medical Solutions. On paper, it looked like a reasonable downgrade. In practice, it was a disaster waiting to happen. Staff had been warning management for weeks. The Apex pumps malfunctioned frequently. The touchscreens froze. Alarms delayed or failed entirely, and critical safety checks occasionally misfired. Their complaints were logged, acknowledged, and then ignored. Administration called them transition issues. At 2:14 a.m., Elena was 2 rooms away, manually drawing blood because the hospital had eliminated the overnight phlebotomy team. The unit was already strained when the sound of a code blue exploded through the corridor. She dropped the vials and ran. Henry Caldwell's room was chaos. When she burst through the door, the monitor showed a rapidly falling heart rate. His skin had gone pale, almost gray. His breathing was shallow, uneven, and collapsing. Elena's eyes went straight to the 4 pump. The Apex device displayed a frozen error screen. No medication was being delivered. No alarm had sounded. The system had failed silently. "Code blue, sicker room 4, she shouted into the corridor, slamming the emergency override as she reached for the tubing. There was no phlebotomy team, no respiratory therapist. The staffing cuts had erased them from the night shift entirely. Elena disconnected the faulty pump and took over manually, calculating dosage by hand with rapid precision. At the same time, she began bagging Henry's airway herself, forcing oxygen into his lungs while maintaining medication flow. Every second required a decision. Every decision carried risk. Dr. Benjamin Rossi arrived late, pulled from another floor, out of breath, already behind. "There's no RT available," he said, scanning the scene. "I know," Elena replied without looking up. For 10 minutes, the room became a controlled emergency. Machines failed. Systems lagged. Human hands compensated for everything the hospital had stripped away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the monitor stabilized into a weak but steady rhythm. Henry Caldwell was alive. Dr. Rossi stepped back, wiping sweat from his forehead, staring at the frozen apex screen. "That machine nearly killed him," he said quietly, voice tight with exhaustion and anger. Elena kept her eyes on the chart as she wrote. "It didn't nearly kill him, Dr. Rossi," she said calmly. "Arthur Sterling did." The next morning, Elena did not go home. Instead, she waited. St. Vincent's held its quarterly town hall in the main auditorium, a mandatory gathering for department heads and any staff who could be spared. It was traditionally a performance, not a discussion. Arthur Sterling used it to present financial victories, dressed up as operational progress. At 9 a.m., the auditorium was packed. Rows of nurses, doctors, and administrators sat under harsh lighting, silent and tense. Sterling stood at the podium, confident and composed, a presentation glowing behind him. "As you can see," he said, gesturing toward a slide of cost reductions. "By optimizing our supply chain and eliminating inefficiencies, St. Vincent is projected to increase net revenue by 12% this quarter." He paused, satisfied, letting the numbers settle over the room. "This is the future of healthcare efficiency." A brief silence followed. Then he smiled. "Any questions?" It was a formality. No one ever spoke. Until now. From the middle of the auditorium, Elena Higgins stood up. No blazer, no executive polish. Just a nurse who had spent the night before keeping someone alive that the system had nearly killed. Elena was still wearing the same wrinkled, coffee-stained scrubs from her brutal night shift. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders, but her expression remained calm and determined. In her hands, she carried a bulky object, concealed beneath a white hospital towel. The moment she stood up in the packed auditorium, an uneasy silence swept across the room. Nurses exchanged nervous glances. Doctors looked up from their phones and notebooks. Administrative staff froze in their seats. A few rows ahead, Sarah Jenkins turned around. The color drained from her face as she recognized what Elena was doing. "Elena, no," she mouthed silently. But Elena kept walking. She moved down the center aisle with steady purpose. The only sound in the massive auditorium was the squeak of her rubber-soled nursing shoes against the polished linoleum floor. Every eye followed her. Arthur Sterling watched from the stage, confusion quickly hardening into irritation. Elena climbed the steps without hesitation. "Excuse me, nurse," Sterling snapped sharply. "This is a leadership briefing. Return to your seat immediately." She didn't even look at him. Instead, she walked directly to the podium. Then she pulled away the towel. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. The object beneath was a Hospital 4 infusion pump. The faulty apex for pump from Henry Caldwell's room. Its screen was still frozen on the same fatal error code. Elena lifted it slightly and slammed it onto the podium. The loud crack echoed throughout the auditorium. "My name is Elena Higgins," she said into the microphone. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Years spent commanding trauma rooms had given her a presence that demanded attention. "I am a registered nurse in St. Vincent's Cardiac Intensive Care Unit." The room remained completely silent. Last night, this machine failed while administering life-sustaining medication to a post-operative cardiac patient. She pointed directly at the frozen display. The medication stopped. The alarm system failed. The patient suffered a cardiac emergency as a direct result. Shock spread across the crowd. Doctors shifted uncomfortably. Several nurses lowered their heads. Everyone knew about the equipment complaints. Nobody had expected someone to publicly challenge Sterling. His face reddened immediately. "Nurse Higgins," he said through clenched teeth, "this is highly inappropriate. Equipment concerns are handled through proper channels. If there's a maintenance issue, you submit a report." His eyes narrowed. "You are risking your employment." Elena finally turned toward him. Her expression remained calm. "I am risking far less than what you're risking." The words landed like a hammer. She faced the audience. Under the new staffing mandates imposed by executive leadership, I was responsible for 4 critically ill patients simultaneously. Murmurs spread through the room. Last night, pure luck allowed me to hear the central monitor alarm in time. She paused. If I had been with another patient at the far end of the unit, Henry Caldwell would be dead. The auditorium fell silent again. Sterling stepped forward. You will stop this immediately. Elena ignored him. Instead, she took another step toward the microphone. Your staffing policies violate accepted intensive care safety standards. Her voice rang through the auditorium. The equipment purchased under your cost-cutting initiative has repeatedly malfunctioned. She pointed at the Apex pump. This device should never have been used for critical care patients. Then she looked directly at Sterling. You call this efficiency? She paused. It isn't efficiency. It's negligence. The room exploded with whispers. Sterling's composure cracked. You are fired, Higgins. His voice thundered through the speakers. Effective immediately. Security will escort you from this building. The threat hung in the air. Elena didn't blink. Instead, she calmly reached into her scrub pocket. She removed a thick manila envelope. Then she dropped it on top of the broken pump. The sound echoed across the stage. Inside that envelope, she said clearly, are the telemetry logs from last night's incident, signed by both myself and Dr. Benjamin Rossi. Sterling's expression changed instantly. The confidence vanished. Also included are sworn statements from 6 nurses documenting similar equipment failures during the past month. The audience erupted. People began talking openly. Some stood. Others stared at Sterling in disbelief. Elena continued. Copies have already been sent to regulatory agencies and investigative reporters. For the first time since taking control of St. Vincent's, Arthur Sterling looked genuinely afraid. He understood exactly what had happened. This wasn't an emotional outburst. It wasn't a desperate employee lashing out. It was evidence, documented, verified, and impossible to silence. Without another word, Elena turned away from the podium. She left the broken machine and the envelope sitting beneath the stage lights. Then she walked back down the aisle. Her shoulders were straight. Her head was high. And behind her, the silence that had controlled St. Vincent's Medical Center for months finally shattered. Elena Higgins knew the battle had only begun. Standing on that stage and exposing Arthur, Sterling had shattered the illusion that he was untouchable. For months, the hospital staff had viewed him as an unstoppable force, a man who could hire, fire, intimidate, and silence anyone who challenged him. Now that illusion was broken, but Elena also understood something equally important. Cornered predators were often the most dangerous, and Arthur Sterling had just been cornered in front of an entire hospital. By noon that same day, Elena was officially unemployed. 2 security guards escorted her through St. Vincent's main lobby, while employees watched from nursing stations and hallway intersections. Some looked away nervously. Others offered small nods of support when the guards weren't looking. Outside, a bitter Chicago wind whipped across the parking lot. As Elena stepped through the sliding glass doors, the older of the 2 guards paused. Frank Dawson had worked hospital security for nearly 15 years after retiring from the police department. He adjusted his cap and looked at her. Miss Higgins, he said quietly. Elena stopped. Frank gave a small nod. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen in that building. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he tipped his hat. Good luck. Elena smiled faintly before turning toward the city streets. She didn't go home. She didn't cry. And she certainly didn't regret what she had done. Instead, she headed downtown to meet Richard Hayes, a semi-retired whistleblower attorney with a reputation for destroying corrupt institutions. More importantly, Hayes had once been a close friend of Elena's late father. If anyone knew how to fight a man like Arthur Sterling, it was him. Meanwhile, inside St. Vincent's Medical Center, Sterling was launching a full-scale counterattack. He understood exactly how dangerous Elena's accusations could become. One nurse speaking out could be dismissed. One nurse with evidence was a problem. One nurse who inspired others was a catastrophe. His first target was Dr. Benjamin Rossi. Late that afternoon, Rossi received an order to report to the executive offices. The young resident entered Sterling's corner office with a knot in his stomach. The room itself felt like a different world from the hospital floors below. Expensive artwork hung on the walls. Imported leather furniture surrounded the polished mahogany desk. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Chicago skyline. Everything radiated wealth. Everything radiated power. Sterling remained seated behind his desk. "Have a seat, Dr. Rossi." Rossi obeyed. For nearly a minute, Sterling said nothing. The silence felt deliberate, calculated. Finally, Sterling folded his hands. "I understand last night was difficult." Rossi remained silent. "Stress can affect memory," Sterling continued, "especially after extended shifts." The implication was obvious. "I remember exactly what happened," Rossi said carefully. Sterling's eyes hardened. "The apex pump malfunctioned. Nurse Higgins and I documented everything accurately." For several seconds, Sterling simply stared at him. Then his tone changed. "Benjamin, you're a third-year resident." He opened a folder. "You have approximately $250,000 in student debt." Another page. "You have fellowship applications pending." Another page. "And a child due in 3 months." Rossi felt his stomach tighten. Sterling leaned forward. "If you maintain your signature on those reports, I will initiate an internal investigation regarding your management of Henry Caldwell's cardiac arrest." The threat hung in the air. Sterling slid a document across the desk. "This report reflects the actual findings." Rossi looked down. The new report blamed the incident entirely on operator error. It portrayed Elena as a disgruntled employee who had mishandled equipment before her termination. Beside the document rested an expensive silver fountain pen. "Sign it." Rossi stared at the pen. His mind raced. Years of sacrifice. Endless overnight shifts. Mountains of debt. His wife waiting at home. His unborn child. Everything he had worked for suddenly seemed balanced on the edge of a knife. Slowly, his hand moved toward the pen. Then the office door opened. Head nurse Sarah Jenkins stepped inside. The executive assistant rushed behind her. "Sir, she wouldn't." Sarah ignored everyone. "Dr. Rossi." Her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had spent 20 years in intensive care. "Bed 4 requires physician authorization for a medication adjustment." Sterling shot to his feet. "Get out of my office immediately." Sarah didn't even look at him. Her eyes remained fixed on Rossi. "Ben." The young doctor looked up. "A patient needs you." The words were simple, but they cut through every threat Sterling had made. Sarah took a step closer. "Let administrators worry about paperwork." She pointed toward the door. "You became a doctor to take care of patients." Rossi looked down at the pen. Then he pushed it away. He stood up. Without saying a word to Sterling, he walked out of the office. Sarah followed. The moment they entered the concrete stairwell, Rossi leaned against the wall and buried his face in his hands. "He's going to destroy me," he whispered. Sarah gripped his shoulder firmly. "No." Rossi looked up. "No, he isn't," she said, "because we're not fighting him by ourselves anymore." That evening, a quiet rebellion began inside St. Vincent's. The staff called it the Higgins Ledger. Deep in the hospital basement sat an abandoned records room filled with dusty cabinets and forgotten files. Few people ever entered it. Inside a mislabeled cabinet marked 1998 dietary requisitions, Sarah placed a thick black binder. One by one, nurses began adding reports. Equipment failures, unsafe staffing assignments, medication delays, near-fatal incidents, stories that management had ignored, evidence that could not be erased from a computer system or altered by executives. By midnight, the binder already contained dozens of pages. And with every new entry, Elena Higgins' fight grew stronger, even though she was no longer inside the building. The Higgins Ledger quickly became the hospital's best-kept secret. What began as a single black binder hidden in a dusty basement records room evolved into something much larger. Word spread through St. Vincent's Medical Center with astonishing speed. Nurses whispered about it during shift changes. Orderlies mentioned it while transporting patients. Cafeteria workers passed information between departments. Even janitors quietly contributed observations gathered during overnight rounds. Everyone knew where the binder was. More importantly, everyone knew why it existed. If an apex infusion pump malfunctioned, it was documented. if a patient's call button went unanswered because a single nurse was responsible for 4 critically ill patients, it was documented. If a surgery was complicated by defective supplies purchased through Sterling's cost-cutting initiatives, evidence found its way into the binder. Photographs were printed at home. Maintenance reports were copied. Incident forms that mysteriously disappeared from digital systems suddenly reappeared in paper form. Page after page accumulated. The binder became a record of everything management wanted buried, while hospital employees quietly gathered evidence on the inside. Elena Higgins was building something far more powerful on the outside. 3 nights after her termination, she sat in a crowded diner in Logan Square across from Margaret Sullivan. The veteran investigative reporter had built her reputation exposing corruption in healthcare systems across the country. Margaret possessed a permanent look of skepticism, as though she expected every person she met to be lying. A half-finished coffee sat beside her notebook. "So far," Margaret said, flipping through Elena's documents, "you've shown me unsafe staffing, equipment failures, and reckless management." She shrugged. "That's terrible." Then she sighed. "But terrible doesn't always make headlines." Elena remained calm. Margaret continued. "Hospitals cut corners every day. Regulators complain. Lawyers file paperwork. Administrators deny responsibility." She closed the folder. "If you want government agencies involved, I need something bigger than negligence." For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Elena slid another manila folder across the table. Margaret opened it. Inside were dozens of photocopied purchasing records. "Before I became a trauma nurse," Elena said quietly, "I worked in medical procurement and billing." Margaret looked up. "I know how supply contracts work." The reporter returned her attention to the documents. Elena pointed to a specific page. Sterling claimed Apex Medical Solutions was selected because they submitted the lowest bid. "So, look at the corporate address." Margaret scanned the paperwork. A Delaware post office box. "Exactly." Elena leaned forward. "My attorney and I spent 3 days tracing incorporation records." Margaret's expression slowly changed. "What did you find?" "Apex Medical Solutions isn't independent." The reporter sat upright. Elena tapped another document. "It belongs to a holding company called Vanguard Holdings." Margaret froze. She recognized the name immediately. Arthur Sterling used to work there. Elena nodded. He wasn't just an employee. Another page slid across the table. He was a managing partner. The diner suddenly seemed very quiet. Margaret quickly reviewed the ownership records. The implications became clear within seconds. Sterling hadn't simply purchased cheaper equipment. According to the documents, he had financial ties to the company selling that equipment. A potential conflict of interest. Possibly much more. He used hospital funds to buy products connected to a company he profits from. Margaret asked, "That's what the records suggest." Elena's voice remained steady. If those purchases were concealed from regulators and oversight boards, we're no longer talking about poor management. Margaret slowly closed the folder. A dangerous smile appeared. Now she understood. This wasn't merely a hospital story. This was a scandal. "Give me 72 hours, she said. "I'm going to turn every stone over." 3 weeks after Elena's dismissal, the story exploded. At exactly 5 a.m. on a stormy Thursday morning, the Chicago Tribune published Margaret Sullivan's investigation. The article dominated the newspaper's homepage. The headline immediately drew attention across the city. The story detailed allegations of undisclosed financial relationships, questionable procurement practices, equipment concerns, and mounting reports from hospital staff regarding patient safety. Former employees, anonymous sources, and internal documents painted a troubling picture. Within an hour, the story had spread across television stations, radio programs, and social media. By 6:15 a.m., Arthur Sterling's phone was ringing nonstop. Board members demanded answers. Attorneys requested emergency meetings. Investors wanted explanations. For the first time since arriving at St. Vincent's, Sterling found himself on the defensive. He hurried into a suit and rushed toward downtown Chicago. desperately trying to contain the growing crisis. But events were already moving beyond his control. At 6:30 a.m., government vehicles arrived outside St. Vincent's Medical Center. Representatives from multiple oversight agencies entered the building. Hospital employees watched from windows and nursing stations as investigators crossed the lobby, carrying briefcases and document cases. Whispers immediately spread throughout the facility. People knew exactly why they were there. 15 minutes later, Sterling stormed through the hospital entrance. His tie was crooked. Sweat covered his forehead despite the cold morning air. Ignoring frightened staff members, he hurried toward the elevators while speaking urgently into his phone. "Get maintenance moving," he ordered. Immediately, he continued issuing instructions as he crossed the lobby. Reports, equipment, storage areas, everything suddenly mattered. The investigation had arrived, and for the first time, Arthur Sterling realized that the system he had controlled so completely might finally be turning against him. As the elevator doors closed and carried him toward the 5th floor, one thought dominated his mind. He wasn't trying to protect the hospital anymore. He was trying to save himself. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Arthur Sterling stepped forward and stopped cold. The hallway ahead was completely blocked. Standing shoulder to shoulder across the corridor were a dozen nurses in blue hospital scrubs. Their expressions were calm, determined, and utterly unafraid. At the center stood head nurse Sarah Jenkins. Her arms were folded firmly across her chest. She didn't move. Neither did anyone else. Behind the human barricade, near the nurses' station, stood Dr. Benjamin Rossi. In his hands rested the thick black binder that had become legendary throughout St. Vincent's Medical Center, the Higgins Ledger. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Sterling's face twisted with fury. "Move aside, Jenkins." His voice echoed through the hallway. "You are obstructing a critical equipment recall." He pointed aggressively toward the nurses. "Move your staff right now, or every one of you is terminated." The threat would have worked a month earlier. Not today. Not anymore. The nurses remained exactly where they were. No one lowered their eyes. No one stepped back. Months of intimidation had finally lost its power. The fear that once controlled the hospital had been replaced by something far stronger. Unity. Sarah looked directly at him. "There is no equipment recall, Mr. Sterling." Her voice remained calm, measured, certain. Sterling took another step forward. "You have no idea what you're doing." "Oh, I think we do." Sarah tilted her head slightly. "And as for firing us, you don't have that authority anymore." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Sterling's face. Sarah continued. "Employees cooperating with an active federal investigation are protected from retaliation." The color drained from his face. "What investigation?" he demanded. A deep voice answered from behind him. "This one." Sterling spun around. The stairwell door had opened. 2 FBI agents stepped into the corridor, accompanied by representatives from health oversight authorities. Walking calmly beside them was Elena Higgins. Unlike the last time Sterling had seen her, she wasn't standing alone. Now she had an entire hospital standing beside her. The lead agent approached. "Arthur Sterling." Sterling said nothing. The agent removed a folded document from his jacket. "We have a federal warrant authorizing the seizure of administrative records, electronic communications, procurement files, and equipment inventory related to this investigation." The hallway fell silent. Then came the second statement. "We also have a warrant for your arrest." Sterling's confidence evaporated. The words seemed to strike him physically. He looked at the nurses, at Sarah, at Dr. Rossi. Finally, his eyes settled on Elena. For the first time since arriving at St. Vincent's, he appeared completely powerless. "This is ridiculous," he stammered. "You can't do this." One of the agents stepped forward. "We can." Handcuffs clicked open. Sterling's breathing quickened. "I saved this hospital," he protested desperately. "I balanced the books." Elena stepped forward. Her voice remained steady. "You balanced the books using human lives." The hallway was so quiet that every word carried clearly. She looked at the cuffs being secured around his wrists. "Now it's time to answer for the cost." The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the corridor. No one cheered. No one applauded. There was no celebration, only relief. Months of tension seemed to leave the building all at once. As the agents escorted Sterling toward the elevators, the nurses silently stepped aside. He walked between them, without a single person speaking. The man who had ruled through fear left the same way fear always leaves alone. Once he was gone, Dr. Rossi carried the Higgins ledger forward. The thick black binder was handed directly to investigators. Inside were hundreds of pages of reports, photographs, witness statements, maintenance records, and incident logs. Evidence gathered by people who had finally refused to remain silent. By noon, St. Vincent's Board of Directors held an emergency session. Arthur Sterling's employment was terminated immediately. A public statement followed shortly afterward, acknowledging serious failures and oversight and promising sweeping reforms. The board then reached out to the one person whose return could restore trust throughout the hospital, Dr. William Aries. Months earlier, Sterling had dismissed the respected pediatric chief. Now the board asked him to return as interim CEO. Dr. Aries accepted, but only under strict conditions: complete transparency, independent safety reviews, and the immediate restoration of safe nurse-to-patient staffing ratios. The board agreed without hesitation. Later that afternoon, Dr. Aries walked through the SICU. For the first time in months, the atmosphere felt different, lighter, hopeful. He found Elena standing beside the nurse's station, helping Sarah organize schedules and patient assignments. She looked exactly as she always had: coffee-stained scrubs, stethoscope around her neck, focused on patient care. "Miss Higgins," Dr. Aries said warmly. Elena looked up. "The board has authorized me to offer you a leadership position." He smiled. "Director of Nursing Operations." The offer came with greater authority, a substantial salary increase, and a seat at every executive meeting. "You could help shape the future of this hospital," he added. Elena considered it briefly. Then she looked around. She saw tired nurses, smiling for the first time in weeks. She heard the steady hum of reliable equipment. She watched staff members caring for patients instead of fighting administrators. Finally, she picked up a fresh chart and adjusted her stethoscope. "Thank you, doctor," she said, "but this is where I belong." She glanced toward the patient rooms. Someone has to make sure the people upstairs remember who the hospital is actually for. Years later, people would remember the investigation, the arrests, and the scandal. But inside St. Vincent's, they remembered something else. One nurse who refused to stay silent. Because a hospital's true strength is never found in budgets, buildings, or executive offices. It's found in the people who show up every day to protect the lives entrusted to their care.